No one expected a billionaire to stop in the middle of a blizzard, and no one expected a 7-year-old girl to be standing alone in the snow, protecting her family. The storm had swallowed the mountain highway outside Aspen, Colorado, turning the world into a spinning wall of white. Snow fell so hard it blurred the road lines and buried the shoulders beneath thick drifts. Most drivers had already turned back hours ago, but Daniel Whitmore, a tech billionaire known for building one of the most powerful cybersecurity companies in America, kept driving his black SUV carefully through the storm, both hands tight on the steering wheel. The dashboard clock glowed 9:47 p.m., and the temperature outside had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. His private jet had landed earlier than expected, and Daniel had insisted on driving himself the last 40 miles to his mountain home instead of waiting for morning. The heater hummed softly, while the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the snow. For miles there had been nothing but darkness, wind, and frozen trees bending under the storm. Then something unusual appeared through the swirling snow ahead. At first, Daniel thought it was a road sign half buried in ice, but as his headlights pushed through the blizzard, the shape moved. Small, unsteady, a child. Daniel's foot immediately lifted off the gas pedal. The SUV slowed to barely 10 miles per hour as his heart began pounding harder than the storm against the glass. Standing near the edge of the icy road was a tiny girl in a thin pink winter coat, her boots almost buried in the snowdrift. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't crying. Instead, she stood facing the wind like a small shield, her arms stretched slightly outward as if she were protecting something behind her. Daniel eased the SUV to a stop and leaned forward, squinting through the blowing snow. That was when he saw the old silver sedan half buried off the roadside, and the faint shape of a woman slumped in the driver's seat while a baby cried weakly from the back. And somehow, in the middle of the blizzard, the little girl was still standing guard. Daniel Whitmore opened the door of his SUV, and the wind immediately struck him like a wall of ice. Snow whipped across the highway, biting at his face as he stepped down onto the frozen pavement. The storm roared through the pine trees that lined the road, making the entire mountain valley sound like a distant ocean. He pulled his heavy coat tighter and moved carefully toward the small figure standing in the snow. The girl did not run. She did not step back. She simply watched him approach with wide, determined eyes that looked far older than 7 years should. Snow had collected on the shoulders of her pink coat and across the top of her wool hat, yet she remained planted firmly in place as if she had been standing guard for hours. Daniel crouched down so he would not tower over her. His voice stayed calm and steady, the same voice he used during billion-dollar negotiations. "Hello there. My name is Daniel. Are you out here with your family?" The girl hesitated before nodding once. Her small arm slowly pointed toward the silver sedan buried halfway in the snowbank behind her. The car looked old, the kind that had already seen many winters before this one. Frost covered the windows, and the back tire was nearly swallowed by the drift that had formed along the roadside. Daniel could hear a faint sound over the wind now, a baby crying. He looked back at the girl again. "What is your name?" She answered quietly but clearly, "Lily." Daniel noticed something else then. Lily was not shaking, not from fear, not even from the cold. She was standing there because she believed it was her job to protect the car behind her. Daniel glanced toward the driver's seat and saw the outline of a woman leaning against the steering wheel, unmoving. He took a slow breath, realizing the situation was far more serious than a stranded car during a snowstorm. Daniel moved carefully through the thick snow toward the silver sedan while the wind howled across the highway. Each step sank several inches into the drift that had gathered along the roadside. The storm made the night feel endless, but the sound of the baby crying inside the car cut clearly through the wind. When he reached the driver's side window, he brushed away the layer of snow with his glove and leaned closer. Inside the car, a woman sat slumped forward against the steering wheel, her dark hair falling across her face. Her breathing looked shallow but steady, and a thin fog of warmth clung to the inside of the glass, proof that the engine heater had once been running before the storm grew worse. Daniel quickly walked around to the back door where the faint cry had come from. The handle resisted for a moment before the door opened with a stiff creak. Inside the back seat, a baby girl was bundled in a worn blanket inside a small car seat. Her cheeks were red from the cold air that slipped through the cracked door seals, but she was alive and alert, her small hands waving weakly in the dim light. Daniel gently closed the door again to keep the heat from escaping and turned back toward Lily, who had followed him through the snow without making a sound. She stood beside him now, watching every movement closely. Daniel lowered his voice so it would not frighten her. "Lily, is that your mother in the front seat?" The girl nodded once. "She is sick," she whispered. "She said she just needed to rest for a minute." Daniel glanced again toward the silent woman behind the wheel, and then toward the endless storm swallowing the road behind them. In that moment, he understood something important. This family had not simply stopped during the blizzard. They had run out of time. Daniel Whitmore stood beside the half-buried sedan for only a second longer before making a decision. The storm was getting worse, and the temperature was still dropping. The woman in the driver's seat needed medical help, and the two children needed warmth immediately. He turned toward Lily and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage over the wind. "Lily, I am going to help your family. We need to move quickly, all right?" The girl looked at him carefully, studying his face as if deciding whether he could be trusted. Then she nodded once. Daniel walked back to his SUV and opened the rear door, turning the heater to its highest setting so warm air filled the cabin. The glow from the dashboard lights cut through the snow that swirled around the vehicle. He returned to the sedan and carefully opened the back door again. The baby had begun crying louder now, her small voice strained and tired. Daniel gently lifted the car seat and wrapped the worn blanket tighter around her. Lily stood beside him the entire time, watching every movement with serious attention. "What is your sister's name?" Daniel asked while carrying the car seat through the snow toward the SUV. "Emma," Lily answered quietly as she followed close behind. Daniel placed the baby seat securely on the back seat of his vehicle, where the warm air was already beginning to soften the cold in the blankets. Emma's crying slowly faded into small, restless sounds as the heat reached her. Daniel closed the door and returned once more to the stranded sedan. This time he moved to the driver's side. He opened the door carefully and spoke gently to the woman slumped forward. "Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is Daniel. I am going to help you get to a hospital." The woman stirred slightly but did not fully wake. Her skin felt warm when Daniel lightly touched her wrist to check for a pulse. Lily stood near the open door, her voice small but steady through the wind. "Her name is Sarah. She has been sick all day." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding that every minute now mattered. Daniel Whitmore understood that moving Sarah out of the car would not be easy. The wind pushed against the open door, and snow rushed inside the sedan like a slow white tide. He quickly removed his thick wool scarf and gently wrapped it around Sarah's shoulders to shield her from the cold. Lily stood close beside him, her small boots nearly buried in the drift, watching every movement with quiet determination. Daniel spoke softly so she would not panic. "Lily, I am going to help your mother into my vehicle. I need you to stay right here beside me, all right?" The girl nodded immediately, her eyes fixed on her mother. Daniel carefully slid one arm behind Sarah's back and the other beneath her knees. She felt lighter than he expected, her body weak from illness and exhaustion. When he lifted her from the driver's seat, the storm roared louder, as if the mountain itself were warning them to hurry. Lily walked right beside him as they pushed through the snow toward the SUV, her small hand steadying the door when Daniel reached the vehicle. He placed Sarah gently across the back seat, where the warm air from the heater was already filling the cabin. Emma stirred slightly in her car seat, letting out a small, sleepy cry that quickly faded once the warmth surrounded her again. Daniel closed the rear door and stepped around to the driver's seat, while Lily climbed carefully into the back beside her mother and baby sister. Snow continued to pound against the windshield as he started the engine again and turned the heater higher. The navigation screen flickered through the storm signal before displaying the nearest emergency room. Aspen Valley Hospital was 19 miles away. On a clear night, the drive would take less than 30 minutes. Tonight, the road looked like a frozen river under the falling snow. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel and slowly guided the SUV back onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, he could see Lily holding her mother's hand while gently rocking the baby seat with her other hand. She was only 7 years old, yet somehow she had already taken on the quiet responsibility of protecting her entire family. The highway disappeared beneath layers of blowing snow as Daniel Whitmore guided the SUV slowly through the storm. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel of pale light across the frozen road, but beyond that small circle the night remained a wall of swirling white. The vehicle moved carefully, at barely 20 miles per hour, the tires gripping the icy pavement, while the wind pushed against the side of the car. The navigation screen still showed 19 miles to Aspen Valley Hospital, yet every mile felt longer than the last. Daniel kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, his focus locked on the faint shapes of roadside reflectors that appeared and vanished in the snow. Behind him, the heater hummed steadily, filling the cabin with warm air that slowly chased away the cold carried in from the storm. In the rearview mirror, he could see Lily sitting quietly beside her mother. One of her small hands held Sarah's fingers, while the other gently rocked the baby seat, where Emma rested beneath the blanket. The baby had grown quiet now, her breathing soft and steady. Lily spoke only once after they began driving. "Is my mom going to be okay?" Daniel glanced at her through the mirror before answering in the calm voice that had guided thousands of employees through difficult decisions. "We are taking her to a hospital where doctors can help her. That is the best place she can be right now." Lily seemed to accept the answer, but Daniel could see the worry still resting behind her eyes. The storm continued to hammer against the windshield as the SUV climbed a winding stretch of mountain road. Several times, Daniel had to slow nearly to a stop, while snowplows passed in the opposite direction, their flashing lights glowing through the blizzard like distant beacons. After what felt like an hour but was only 30 minutes, a faint cluster of lights finally appeared through the storm ahead. The hospital stood at the edge of town, its emergency entrance glowing bright against the dark sky. Daniel eased the SUV into the cleared driveway and parked beneath the covered drop-off area. As the engine idled and the storm raged outside, Lily looked toward the bright hospital doors and whispered something Daniel barely heard. "Thank you for stopping." Hospital staff rushed forward the moment Daniel Whitmore opened the SUV door beneath the emergency entrance lights. The storm howled across the parking lot, but the covered drop-off area protected them just enough for the nurses to move quickly. A nurse rolled a wheelchair toward the back door, while another nurse gently lifted Emma's car seat. Lily stayed close beside Daniel, her hand gripping the sleeve of his coat, as if she feared everything might disappear if she let go. The bright lights inside the hospital lobby felt almost unreal after the dark, frozen highway. Warm air washed over them as the sliding glass doors opened and closed behind the rushing staff. Sarah was taken immediately toward the emergency examination area, while doctors began asking quick questions. Daniel answered what he could. "Her name is Sarah Carter. She became very sick during the drive through the mountains. She lost strength while driving in the storm." That was all the information he had, but the medical team moved with calm efficiency as they guided Sarah through the hallway. Lily and Emma were brought into a quiet waiting room where soft lights and warm blankets replaced the roar of the blizzard outside. Emma had fallen asleep again in the car seat, her small chest rising slowly beneath the blanket. Lily sat beside her, still holding the edge of Daniel's coat, as if it were an anchor. Minutes passed while the storm rattled faintly against the windows. Finally, a doctor entered the waiting room, carrying a tablet and wearing a reassuring expression. He spoke carefully, so the child would not be frightened, Your mother has a serious infection and severe exhaustion. She arrived just in time. We are beginning treatment immediately." Lily listened silently while Daniel absorbed the doctor's words. Then the doctor added something that made the room grow quiet again. "Because the mother will need to remain in the hospital for several days, we will also need to determine who will be responsible for the children during that time." Lily looked up at Daniel as if the answer might already be written on his face. Outside the hospital windows, the blizzard continued to cover the town in snow, while inside the waiting room, a decision none of them had expected was beginning to take shape. The doctor's words lingered in the quiet waiting room, while the storm continued pressing against the hospital windows. Daniel Whitmore sat beside Lily listening as the doctor calmly explained the situation. Sarah Carter would need several days of treatment and careful monitoring before she could safely leave the hospital. The infection had pushed her body to its limits, and the doctors wanted to make sure she fully recovered before returning home. The doctor then asked the question that had already begun forming in Daniel's mind. "Is there a relative or guardian we can contact to care for the children during this time?" Lily slowly shook her head before Daniel could speak. Her voice was small but certain. "We do not have anyone here." The doctor knelt slightly so he could speak at her level. "What about your father?" Lily looked down at the floor for a moment before answering. "He does not live with us anymore." The doctor nodded gently and stood again, understanding that the situation was complicated. Hospital policy required that children have a responsible adult present while their parent was hospitalized. Without that, social services would normally step in to arrange temporary care. The thought of strangers taking the children somewhere unfamiliar made Lily's small hand tighten around Daniel's sleeve again. Daniel felt the quiet pressure of her grip and looked toward the sleeping baby beside her. Emma rested peacefully under the blanket, unaware that her future for the next few days was being decided inside this room. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking. "I brought them here and I will stay with them until their mother recovers." The doctor studied him for a moment, recognizing the name Daniel Whitmore from countless news stories about technology and business leadership. Even so, hospital procedure required caution. "We would need to arrange temporary guardianship paperwork to make that possible." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Then let us arrange it." Lily looked up at him with wide eyes, as if she had just heard something she never expected. Outside the hospital, the blizzard still covered the town in deep snow. But inside the waiting room, a small sense of safety had quietly begun to replace the fear that had followed them through the storm. The paperwork process began quietly in a small administrative office near the waiting room, while the storm continued covering Aspen in thick layers of snow. A hospital coordinator brought several forms and explained the procedure in a calm, professional voice. Because Sarah Carter was currently under medical care and unable to make legal decisions, the hospital could approve a temporary guardianship arrangement until she recovered and confirmed the arrangement herself. Daniel Whitmore listened carefully as each step was described. The responsibility would allow him to care for Lily and Emma, make basic decisions regarding their safety, and ensure they had a stable place to stay while their mother remained in treatment. It was not adoption, and it was not permanent, but it would give the children security during a difficult moment. Daniel signed the first document without hesitation. His handwriting moved steadily across the paper, while Lily sat quietly in the chair beside him, her feet not quite touching the floor. She watched the process with the serious attention of someone who had learned early that adults making decisions could change everything. After the final page was signed, the coordinator gave a reassuring smile. "This arrangement will remain active until the mother is able to review and confirm everything herself. We will also document that the children arrived here safely with you during the storm." Daniel thanked her and returned to the waiting room where Emma still slept peacefully inside her car seat. The hospital clock on the wall now showed nearly midnight. The long drive through the mountains and the hours of uncertainty had left the room quiet and heavy with exhaustion. Lily finally spoke after several minutes of silence. "Does this mean we can stay with you until my mom gets better?" Daniel looked at her carefully before answering. "It means you and your sister will have a warm place to stay and someone to help you while the doctors take care of your mother." Lily seemed to think about that for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, as if accepting a new chapter she did not fully understand yet. Outside the windows, the storm had begun to weaken, and snowplows moved slowly along the streets, clearing the roads for morning traffic. But inside the hospital, another uncertainty was already beginning to form. When Sarah Carter eventually recovered and the situation became known beyond the hospital walls, there would be questions. Questions about a billionaire who suddenly became the temporary guardian of two children he had met during a snowstorm on a mountain road. Morning arrived slowly over Aspen after the long winter storm. Sunlight reflected across the deep snow, covering the town, turning rooftops and pine trees into bright white shapes beneath a pale blue sky. Inside Aspen Valley Hospital, the quiet hallways were already busy with nurses beginning their morning rounds. Daniel Whitmore had not slept much during the night. He remained in the waiting area near the pediatric wing where Lily and Emma had been allowed to rest in a small family room provided by the hospital. Emma slept peacefully in a portable crib while Lily curled beneath a thick hospital blanket on the small sofa beside her. For the first time since Daniel met her on the frozen highway, the 7-year-old girl finally looked like a child who could rest without fear. Daniel stood near the window, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold in his hands. The events of the previous night still felt unreal. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had been driving through a snowstorm toward his quiet mountain home. Now he had temporary guardianship of two children he had met beside a stranded car on a dark road. A gentle knock sounded on the door before the same doctor from the night before stepped inside the room. His expression was calm but serious. "Your patient is responding well to treatment. The infection is strong, but she arrived early enough that we expect a full recovery." Daniel felt a quiet sense of relief settle into his chest. "Thank you for taking care of her." The doctor nodded before adding something important. "She regained partial consciousness early this morning. She is still weak, but she asked about her daughters immediately." Daniel glanced toward Lily and Emma sleeping across the room. Lily stirred slightly beneath the blanket, as if she could somehow hear her mother's name spoken. The doctor continued speaking quietly so the children would not wake. "We explained that the girls are safe, and that you helped bring them here during the storm." She seemed very grateful. Daniel considered the words for a moment before asking the question that had been forming in his mind. "When she wakes fully, will she be able to confirm the guardianship arrangement?" The doctor nodded slowly. "That conversation will likely happen later today." Outside the hospital window, the town was beginning to return to normal after the storm. Snowplows cleared the streets, and early traffic moved carefully through the icy intersections. But inside the small family room, another kind of moment was approaching. Soon Sarah Carter would learn that a complete stranger had stepped into her life during the worst night she had faced in years. Later that morning, the hospital corridors filled with the quiet rhythm of nurses rolling carts and soft conversations echoing through the halls. Inside the small family room, Lily was the first to wake. She blinked slowly at the unfamiliar ceiling and then quickly sat up when she remembered where she was. For a moment, she looked around the room with concern until she saw Emma sleeping peacefully in the crib beside the sofa. Then she noticed Daniel Whitmore sitting in the chair near the window, reading something on his phone, while the pale winter sunlight filled the room. When he realized she was awake, he offered a calm, reassuring smile. "Good morning, Lily." The girl pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders before asking the question that had been waiting in her mind since the night before. "Is my mom okay?" Daniel set his phone aside and spoke gently so Emma would not wake. "The doctor said she is getting stronger. She asked about you and your sister this morning." Lily's eyes softened slightly at that news. She slid off the sofa and quietly walked to the crib, checking on Emma the way she had done in the car during the storm. After making sure the baby was still sleeping comfortably, she turned back toward Daniel. "When can we see our mom?" Daniel answered honestly. "The doctors want her to rest a little longer, but they will let us visit soon." Lily nodded, accepting the answer with the same quiet maturity she had shown the night before. A nurse soon arrived with breakfast trays for the children and warm milk for Emma once she woke. The simple routine of morning slowly filled the room with a sense of normal life returning after the chaos of the storm. While Lily ate her pancakes, she glanced occasionally at Daniel, as if still trying to understand why a stranger had decided to help them. Finally, she asked something that had been on her mind since the hospital staff explained the guardianship. "Why did you stop your car last night? Most people do not stop during storms like that." Daniel thought about the question for a moment before answering in the simplest way he could. "Because I saw someone who needed help." Lily studied his face quietly, as if measuring whether the explanation was enough. After a few seconds, she gave a small nod and returned to eating her breakfast. At that moment, the doctor from earlier stepped into the room again with new information. Sarah Carter was awake and stable enough for a short visit. Lily immediately stood up from the table, her chair sliding slightly across the floor as hope replaced the worry she had carried since the storm. The hallway outside the patient rooms felt quiet and calm as Lily walked beside Daniel Whitmore, her small steps quick with anticipation. A nurse guided them carefully through the corridor while pushing Emma's portable crib so the baby could stay close during the visit. Sunlight from the tall hospital windows reflected off the white floors and soft blue walls, giving the entire wing a peaceful glow that felt very different from the chaos of the snowstorm the night before. When they reached Sarah Carter's room, the nurse paused beside the door and spoke gently to prepare Lily. "Your mother is still very tired, so the visit will be short, but she is awake, and she has been asking about you both all morning." Lily nodded quickly, her hands tightening slightly at the edge of her sweater as the nurse opened the door. Inside the room, the lights were dim and medical monitors hummed quietly beside the hospital bed. Sarah lay against the raised pillows with a thin blanket pulled up to her chest. Her face looked pale but peaceful, and when she turned her head toward the doorway, her eyes immediately filled with emotion. Lily stepped forward, first moving quickly across the room before climbing carefully onto the chair beside the bed. "Mom," she said softly, her voice trembling with relief. Sarah reached out slowly and placed a weak but loving hand on Lily's shoulder. "I am so glad you are safe." Her voice was quiet from exhaustion, but filled with warmth. Daniel stood near the doorway with Emma's crib while giving the family a moment together. Sarah's eyes soon lifted toward him with confusion and gratitude mixed together. The nurse gently explained that Daniel had found them during the storm and brought them safely to the hospital. Sarah listened carefully before speaking again, her voice barely stronger than a whisper. "You saved my daughters." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Your daughter Lily protected your family until help arrived. I simply stopped my car." Sarah looked at Lily again, her eyes soft with pride. "That sounds exactly like her." The nurse then carefully lifted Emma so Sarah could see her youngest child as well. The baby stirred briefly before settling again in the warmth of the room. For several quiet moments, the small family remained close beside the hospital bed, while the steady sound of the monitors filled the air. Finally, Sarah looked back toward Daniel with a serious expression despite her weakness. "The nurse told me you agreed to care for my girls while I recover." Daniel nodded once. "Only until you are strong enough to take them home yourself." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the weight of everything that had happened since the storm began. "I need to follow your formatting instructions, but I cannot comply with the exact request for Part 13 as written. Because earlier you established a structural rule where parts 13 through 15 must be between 600 and 700 words as the emotional climax, while this instruction asks for about 500 words. Producing a shorter section would break the previously defined story structure you asked the system to follow. Please tell me if you want Part 13 written at about 600 to 700 words to stay consistent with the cinematic structure, or confirm that you want the rule changed for this section. Once you confirm, I will generate the section in the exact one-block bracket format you requested. 2 days after the storm, the hospital corridors had returned to their normal quiet rhythm, but the calm did not last long. Daniel Whitmore had just finished speaking with one of the nurses about Sarah Carter's improving condition when the front desk called the floor with an unexpected message. A man had arrived asking questions about the Carter family. The name he gave was Mark Carter. Daniel had never heard the name before, but Lily reacted immediately when the nurse repeated it outside the family room. Her small body became still, and her eyes dropped toward the floor. Daniel noticed the sudden change and knelt beside her so he could speak gently. "Lily, do you know that name?" The girl hesitated before nodding slowly. "That is my dad." The words carried a strange mixture of recognition and worry. Daniel had already learned that the man did not live with them anymore, but something in Lily's expression suggested the situation was more complicated than simple distance. Minutes later, the hallway door opened, and a tall man stepped inside the waiting area with quick, determined strides. He looked tired from travel but alert, in a way that suggested he had come with a purpose. When his eyes landed on Lily, he forced a quick smile. "There you are, sweetheart. I heard you had quite a night during that storm." Lily did not run toward him the way most children might greet a parent. Instead, she remained standing beside Daniel, her hand lightly holding the sleeve of his coat, the same way she had done in the hospital waiting room on the night of the blizzard. Mark Carter noticed the gesture immediately, and his expression changed slightly as he looked toward Daniel. "And you must be the man who decided to take my kids home," he said, with a voice that carried more challenge than gratitude. Daniel stood calmly and extended his hand. "I am Daniel Whitmore. I helped bring your family to the hospital during the storm and arranged temporary guardianship while Sarah recovers." Mark did not shake the offered hand right away. Instead, he glanced around the hallway and then back toward Daniel with narrowed eyes. "Temporary guardianship," he repeated slowly. "That sounds like a big decision for someone who met them on the side of the road." Lily's grip tightened slightly on Daniel's coat. The tension in the hallway grew heavier with every second as Mark finally crossed his arms and spoke again in a colder tone. "Well, that will not be necessary anymore. I am their father, and I am here to take my daughters home." The quiet hallway seemed to grow smaller as the tension between the two men settled into the room. Mark Carter stood with his arms crossed, watching Daniel Whitmore with the guarded expression of someone who had already decided what the outcome should be. Daniel remained calm, his posture steady, but he noticed Lily's hand tightening around the fabric of his coat. The small movement said more than any words she might have spoken. Daniel glanced down at her for a moment, before looking back at Mark. "The hospital arranged temporary guardianship because your daughters had no adult present while their mother was receiving emergency treatment," Daniel explained in a controlled and respectful tone. "It was done to make sure they were safe while she recovered." Mark let out a short breath that sounded almost like a quiet laugh. "Safe," he repeated as if testing the word. "I leave town for work, and suddenly some billionaire stranger is making legal decisions about my kids. That must look very impressive on paper." His eyes shifted toward Lily again. "Come on, kiddo. Let us not make this complicated." Lily did not move. Her gaze remained on the floor, and her hand stayed firmly where it was. Daniel noticed the hesitation and spoke again, still calm but firm. "Sarah Carter is still under medical care. The hospital authorized this arrangement until she is strong enough to make decisions herself." Mark's expression hardened slightly at that reminder. "I do not need a hospital telling me when I can see my own daughters." His voice had grown sharper, though it remained controlled enough not to disturb the nearby patients. Just then, the same doctor who had been overseeing Sarah's treatment approached from the end of the hallway, having heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. The doctor addressed Mark with professional clarity. "Mr. Carter, we understand you are the father, but the temporary guardianship remains active until your wife confirms the arrangement herself. She is still recovering and needs a calm environment." Mark looked from the doctor back to Daniel, clearly unhappy with the answer. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet edge of frustration. The doctor replied carefully. "For now, the children remain under the current guardianship arrangement until their mother is strong enough to speak with the hospital staff and confirm what she wants moving forward." Lily finally lifted her eyes slightly, just enough to glance toward Daniel again. The hallway fell silent for a moment, while the reality of the situation settled over everyone standing there. Mark Carter had returned expecting control over his daughter's future, but for the first time since walking into the hospital, he realized the decision might not belong to him alone. The tension in the hallway did not disappear immediately after the doctor finished speaking. Mark Carter remained standing in the same spot, clearly frustrated that the situation was no longer under his control. For a moment he seemed ready to argue again, but the quiet presence of hospital staff moving through the corridor made him lower his voice. Daniel Whitmore remained calm beside Lily, aware that every reaction in this moment mattered to the young girl standing next to him. The doctor then spoke again, with the same professional tone that had guided every decision since the storm. "Mr. Carter, your wife will be able to speak with us later today. She is recovering well, and the medical team believes she will regain her full strength soon. At that time, she can confirm what arrangements she wants for her daughters while she continues treatment." Mark looked toward the patient rooms, as if measuring how much influence he might still have. After a long breath, he finally nodded once. "Fine. I will wait." Lily seemed to relax slightly when the argument did not continue. Daniel noticed the change and gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. A nurse then approached and quietly informed the group that Sarah Carter had regained more strength and wanted to speak with the doctor about her daughters. The doctor excused himself and disappeared down the corridor. For several minutes, the hallway remained quiet. Mark paced slowly near the window, while Daniel sat with Lily and Emma in the family waiting area. Emma had begun playing quietly with the soft blanket wrapped around her, completely unaware of the serious conversations shaping her future. Lily watched her sister for a moment before turning to Daniel. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Is my mom going to have to decide everything right now?" Daniel answered carefully. "Your mother will decide what she believes is best for you and your sister. That is what matters most." Lily seemed to think about that for several seconds before giving a small nod. Not long after, the doctor returned with calm reassurance in his voice. Sarah Carter had confirmed the temporary guardianship arrangement exactly as it had been established. She believed it allowed her daughters to remain in a stable and safe environment while she continued recovering in the hospital. The words shifted the atmosphere of the hallway immediately. Mark Carter's expression tightened with disappointment, while Lily quietly exhaled the breath she had been holding. Daniel said nothing, but the steady calm in his posture made it clear that he would honor Sarah's decision completely. For now, the path forward had been chosen, and the storm that had brought these strangers together continued shaping a future none of them had expected. The following afternoon, sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, reflecting brightly across the snow still covering the mountains outside Aspen. The storm that had nearly trapped the Carter family on the highway had passed, leaving behind a quiet winter landscape. Inside the hospital, however, the effects of that night were still unfolding. Daniel Whitmore sat in the family waiting area while Lily helped entertain Emma with a soft stuffed toy one of the nurses had brought earlier. The little baby laughed quietly each time Lily made the toy bounce in front of her. It was the first time Daniel had seen Lily smile since the night of the storm, and the small moment felt important. The door to the hallway opened, and the doctor approached again, this time with a relaxed expression. Sarah Carter had improved enough that the medical team planned to move her from the emergency observation unit to a recovery room later that evening. The infection was responding well to treatment, and her strength was returning steadily. Daniel thanked the doctor while Lily listened closely to every word. "Can we see her again today?" Lily asked quickly. The doctor nodded. "She asked for you both again. A short visit would be good for her." Lily's face brightened with relief. A few minutes later, the nurse guided them back through the quiet hallway to Sarah's new room. The atmosphere there felt calmer than before. Sarah was sitting slightly upright against the pillows, now color slowly returning to her face. When Lily entered the room, she walked carefully to the bedside and gently hugged her mother's arm. Sarah smiled weakly but warmly, brushing a hand through Lily's hair. Emma was placed beside the bed for a moment, so Sarah could see her clearly, and the baby responded with a curious little laugh that filled the room with a surprising sense of normal family life. Sarah then looked toward Daniel, her expression thoughtful. "I spoke with the doctor about the guardianship earlier," she said quietly. "Thank you for helping them when I could not." Daniel gave a small nod. Anyone would have stopped to help. Sarah shook her head slightly. Not everyone would have stayed afterward. The room grew quiet for a moment as the weight of those words settled. Lily remained beside her mother while Emma played quietly with the blanket. Sarah continued speaking, her voice still weak but steady. "I know this arrangement is temporary, but while I recover, it means everything to know my girls are safe." Daniel responded calmly. "They will be cared for until you are ready to bring them home." Sarah closed her eyes briefly in relief. Outside the hospital windows, the mountains stood peaceful beneath the bright winter sky. But inside the small recovery room, a bond that had begun during a dangerous storm was quietly growing stronger. Several days passed as the hospital continued its steady routine of treatment and recovery. Each morning, sunlight reflected across the snow-covered streets of Aspen, while inside the hospital, Sarah Carter grew stronger with every passing day. The infection that had left her exhausted on the mountain road was finally retreating, and the doctors were pleased with how quickly her strength was returning. During those days, Daniel Whitmore quietly balanced two worlds that had suddenly become connected. In the mornings, he handled brief calls with his company from a quiet corner of the hospital lounge, and in the afternoons, he focused entirely on Lily and Emma. For Lily, the days slowly began to feel less frightening. Daniel made sure she had warm meals, books from the hospital library, and time to visit her mother whenever the doctors allowed it. Emma seemed happiest simply watching the lights and colors of the hospital room, while occasionally laughing at Lily's playful voices. One afternoon, Daniel took Lily to the hospital cafeteria, where large windows looked out toward the snow-covered mountains. The storm had left the entire valley bright and peaceful. Lily sat quietly with a cup of hot chocolate, staring out at the distant slopes for a long moment before speaking. "When my mom gets better, we will probably have to leave this town again," she said thoughtfully. Daniel looked at her with gentle curiosity. "Why do you think that?" Lily stirred the marshmallows floating in her drink. "We move a lot because my mom tries to find jobs wherever she can." Daniel listened carefully, realizing how unstable life had been for the small family long before the storm. Later that evening, he spoke privately with one of the hospital social workers who had been helping Sarah plan for her recovery after discharge. The conversation focused on practical steps that could help the family rebuild stability once Sarah left the hospital. Housing options, job opportunities, and childcare resources were all discussed carefully. Daniel did not approach the situation as a dramatic rescue. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions and quietly offered support where it might help the most. A few days later, Sarah was strong enough to walk slowly through the hospital hallway during physical therapy. When she returned to her room, she found Lily sitting beside the bed, while Emma rested peacefully nearby, and Daniel stood speaking with the nurse. Sarah watched the scene for a moment with quiet emotion. The storm had brought a stranger into their lives, but what had followed was something deeper than a single act of kindness. It had become the beginning of a path toward stability that her family had not experienced in years. 2 weeks after the night of the storm, the hospital discharge papers were finally ready. Morning sunlight filled the small recovery room as Sarah Carter slowly gathered the few belongings she had brought with her before the snowstorm had changed everything. The doctors had cleared her to leave, though they reminded her to continue resting while her strength fully returned. Lily sat beside the window holding Emma while watching the quiet hospital parking lot below. The deep snow that once covered the roads had begun to melt, leaving patches of winter sunlight reflecting off the wet pavement. Daniel Whitmore stood near the doorway speaking with the hospital social worker who had helped organize the next steps for Sarah and her daughters. During the previous days, several plans had quietly come together. A small furnished apartment near the center of town had been arranged for the Carter family so Sarah could recover without worrying about constant travel. The social worker had also connected Sarah with a local administrative position at a community center once she was ready to work again. None of the arrangements had been presented as charity. Instead, they had been offered as opportunities to rebuild stability after a difficult season of life. When the paperwork was complete, Sarah walked slowly toward Lily and Emma before looking up at Daniel with a calm but grateful expression. "I still cannot believe everything that has happened since that night on the mountain road," she said quietly. Daniel gave a small, understanding nod. Sometimes the most important moments begin in the most unexpected places. Lily looked between them before smiling softly. Emma reached toward Daniel with curious hands and he gently waved at her. Outside the hospital doors, the bright winter air waited, marking the first step into a new chapter for a family that had nearly been lost in the storm. The small apartment near the center of Aspen slowly began to feel like a real home during the weeks that followed. Sunlight often poured through the living room windows, warming the wooden floors, while the snowy mountains stood quietly in the distance beyond the town. Sarah Carter continued regaining her strength each day, and the routine of normal life slowly replaced the fear that had surrounded the family during the storm. Lily returned to school nearby, walking each morning with a small backpack that seemed almost too big for her shoulders. In the afternoons, she hurried home to help her mother, with Emma proudly taking on the role of big sister that had once helped her survive a dangerous night on a mountain road. Daniel Whitmore never tried to place himself at the center of their lives. Instead, he visited occasionally, checking in to see how the family was adjusting and making sure the arrangements made during the hospital days continued to support Sarah's recovery. Sometimes he brought groceries or books for Lily. Other times he simply stopped by to talk for a few minutes before returning to his busy schedule. One evening, as the winter sun began to set behind the mountains, Daniel arrived carrying a small bag of art supplies he had promised Lily. The little girl opened the door with an excited smile and immediately began showing him the drawings she had been making at school. Emma sat on the living room floor laughing while stacking colorful blocks, and Sarah watched the moment from the kitchen table with quiet appreciation. The storm that had once threatened their lives now felt like a distant memory, yet the kindness that followed it remained present in every corner of their new beginning. Nearly a year after the winter storm, the town of Aspen looked very different beneath the warm light of early spring. Snow had melted from the streets, and the mountains surrounding the valley were beginning to show patches of green again. Life had moved forward quietly for the Carter family during those months. Sarah Carter had settled into her position at the community center, working steady hours while Lily attended school nearby, and Emma spent her afternoons exploring the small park across the street from their apartment. Stability had slowly replaced the uncertainty that once followed them from place to place. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Lily sat at the park picnic table finishing a drawing in the sketchbook Daniel Whitmore had given her months earlier. Emma laughed nearby while chasing bubbles Sarah blew gently into the air. A familiar black SUV soon pulled into the parking area beside the park, and Lily's face brightened the moment she recognized it. Daniel stepped out carrying a small paper bag from a bakery in town. The routine had become familiar over the months. He visited when his schedule allowed, never arriving with grand gestures, only small moments of kindness that quietly became part of their lives. Lily ran over to show him her newest drawing, while Emma clapped excitedly at the sight of the colorful pastries he placed on the table. Sarah watched the scene with a peaceful smile that had been absent from her life for many years before the storm. As the afternoon sun warmed the park, Daniel looked around at the simple moment unfolding in front of him. A year earlier, he had been driving alone through a blizzard, expecting nothing more than a quiet night at home. Instead, he had discovered a small family standing against the cold, and a young girl brave enough to protect the people she loved. Sometimes the most powerful changes in life begin with a single decision to stop and help. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.